Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Bible Yogi. I'm your host, Douglas Roberts, and today we will be continuing our discussion of the Archko volume. As I noted in an earlier episode, there was some controversy surrounding this book. And if you go to ChatGPT and say, hey, what about the Archko volume? It'll say, oh, that was largely discredited and all this. And a lot of people firmly believe that the book has been, soundly discredited, done deal. This conclusion is pretty much based on the writings of Edward Goodspeed, Reverend Edward Goodspeed, who lambasted Reverend Mahan's book in his own book titled Strange New Gospels that he wrote 50 years after Mahan's book. This book is nearly universally cited when naysayers seek to discredit the Archko volume. So let's start at the beginning. When Reverend Mahan published his book, there was another Presbyterian minister by the name of Reverend Quarrel, who did not appreciate the notoriety and fame that Reverend Mahan was receiving, the attention he was receiving from the public about his findings. All these writings from Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas that he was touting as genuine. So, Reverend Quarrel made the following charges: that Reverend Mahan falsified his trips abroad, that they never happened. He never went to Constantinople or the Vatican, and never researched these documents in their libraries. He was also accused, Reverend Mahan was accused, of 2 accounts of plagiarism. One was for a pamphlet that he reprinted called Pilate's Court. A different translation of a similar document called the Acta Pilate did appear in the Archko volume, but it was different. And another account or accusation was for an article that Reverend Mahan wrote where he referenced a passage from Ben-Hur but did not give the Ben-Hur attribution like he should have. So as a result of this trial, Reverend Mahan was suspended from the Presbyterian ministry for a year as a result of this trial. Now, on the charges of falsifying his trips abroad, Reverend Mahan was found not sustained, meaning the accusations did not have enough evidence to continue, so they were not sustained. On the other 2 charges, they were sustained. But this is not for the translation or version of the Pilate's report found in the Archko volume, number 1. And number 2, the Ben-Hur accusation was for an article that had nothing to do with the Archko volume, was published some decades earlier when Reverend Mahan was a much younger reverend and probably a little bit naive and never expected to be on trial for the Archko volume. I don't believe he even conceived of the thing yet. So in other words, Reverend Quarrel came at Reverend Mahan with a phone book of charges, hoping something would stick and Mahan would be discredited. But he would certainly be quite content if the credibility of Reverend Mahan would then be diminished, and thus the associated authenticity of the Archko volume, or the perception of the associated authenticity of the Archko volume. Now back to Edward Goodspeed. He was a religious professor at the University of Chicago, and he contributed his own translations of the Apocrypha and the Bible. And he also wrote books about Paul the Apostle and one called The Life of Jesus. Now, the Apocrypha are biblical or related writings not forming part of the accepted canon of Scripture, some of it which might be of doubtful authorship or authenticity. So, I don't know why Goodspeed's worried about, the authenticity of Mahan's work when he's busy translating stuff that we've already decided was of doubtful authorship and authenticity. So it's like good for the goose, but not for the gander kind of thing. And I found that this was just kind of interesting. Let me get this centered. Hang on. There you go. That's a little better. So I found this little article about it, and they reviewed Goodspeed's translation of the Bible. and the title of it was Monkeying with the Bible. So you can tell right away they didn't like his translation. This is written by R. Brian Bademan. The reception of Goodspeed's Bible translation was poor and led to the following essays. Devotion to the Bible remains an underappreciated aspect of American religious life, partly because it fails to generate controversy. This essay opens a window onto America's relationship with the Bible by exploring a controversial moment in the history of the Bible in America. The public reception of University of Chicago professor Edward J. Goodspeed's American Translation, 1923. Remember that the Strange New Gospels was written like a decade later. Initially, at least, most Americans flatly rejected Goodspeed's impeccably credentialed attempt to cast the language of the Bible in contemporary American English. Accusations of the professor's irreligion, bad taste, vulgarity, and crass modernity emerged from nearly every quarter of the Protestant establishment, with the exception of some card-carrying theological modernists, testifying to a widespread but unexplored attachment to the notion of a traditional Bible in the early 20th century. By examining this barrage of reaction, Monkeying with the Bible argues that Protestants, along with some others in 1920s America, believed that traditional biblical language was among the forces that helped stabilize the development of American civilization. So this was an important work. I don't know about you, but writing your own translation of the Bible, that's like 2.5 million words. It's a huge amount of work. And to have that effort pretty much roundly, not condemned, but roundly disliked, it probably affected Goodspeed psychologically, and maybe he didn't appreciate the fact that Mahan was, still idolized 50 years later, or still appreciated 50 years later. So, all right. When I found out about the controversy surrounding the Archko volume, I tried to do my own research, and my approach was to research all of the names and people that Reverend Mahan mentioned in the beginning of his book, and this included rabbis and historians like Tacitus and Josephus and other rabbis. And I got a list at the end of this episode, so I'll go over that then. But anyway, I was soon overwhelmed. I found that Reverend Mahan's book was copiously documented, and the amount of knowledge that he drew from like 17th century and 15th century theologians from all around the globe, from Germany and England, and he references Jewish historians, all kinds of stuff. I was very impressed with the amount of scholarship involved in the Archko volume, especially the letters of Hillel. I covered all that later. So this is crazy. I was overwhelmed, and so lo and behold, when I went to look up the link for the Archko volume on Amazon so I could share it with you, my devoted following, I found this book by Edward Elkins. And this guy, he did what I would have loved to have done, and that is he spent 10 years of his life documenting the authenticity of the Archko volume. And it's a great book, and I'm hoping to talk to him and have an episode with him one day. Stay tuned. From his book, though, and this is something I swear, I just opened it up and poof, right to this page. This is exactly what I wanted to find. And later on, when I read the whole thing, I found he goes, if you jump to this chapter first, and I was like, well, I did. He quotes Edward Goodspeed from 1950 from his book, A Life of Jesus. Let's read it together. Pages 123 to 124. Then he put the question to them personally, but who do you say that I am? What part did they think he was to play? What place was he to take in the progress of religion? It was no mere intelligence test. He was actually consulting them. He was weighing his own future course. He must find a new avenue of approach to the people, or he would be snuffed out as John had been, obscurely in a prison cell, his work only begun. What? It's like Goodspeed thinks that Jesus was just some dude who started a religious movement and was soliciting opinions from his followers. Well, what should I do next, everybody? Let's vote on it. Is that ridiculous? So it's clear that Goodspeed was not a Christian. He was not a believer. And therefore, every single thing Mahan wrote had to be false. It had to be lies. Because if it was true, then everything Goodspeed ever said in his life was false. And that's, of course, unacceptable. And here I am once again stealing my own thunder. But Goodspeed, he's not actually a believer, even though he's a reverend. I ran into a guy like this when I went to college back at MSU. There was this religious professor, and that's what he did for a living, was teach the Bible. And he didn't believe a word of it. He said, oh, it's just stories. And then he went on to talk about, when Moses struck the rock and water came from it, he just happened to hit the right rock. It's not uncommon for you to break rocks and have water gush from them, apparently. And then the whole thing about the Red Sea parted, oh, there's unseasonably strong winds that dried out the Red Sea. I'm like, what? If you remember some of my early episodes, 1 and 2, I talked about this kind of tomfoolery. When you read the Bible, you have to just accept the fact that it is saying this is about God. This is about men who are interacting with the real God. So it's not made up stuff. It's not a bunch of morons who went around going, oh, it rained, it must be God. It was like, no, it's not what it's saying. It's not saying interpret these natural events, and that's why we all believe. Anyway, Goodwin was highly motivated to find fault with this book. He spent little to no time attempting to discredit the contents of the Archko volume. In fact, he didn't. That is, he found no occasion anywhere therein to point to flawed, wrong, misleading, or utterly biblically inaccuracies. I don't know, I fumbled that one, but this kind of begs the question of whether or not he even read it. Surely someone who found contention with Jesus, questioning who he was, could find something to complain about. But no, there's not a single point that he drew from the book and said, yeah, there's no way Pilate said this. And it's like, because that didn't happen according to the Bible. No, everything in the Archko volume is substantiated by the Bible. That's what's so incredible about it. Instead, Goodspeed focused on facts that he spent little to no time footnoting or expounding upon why we should take his word over Mahan's. In fact, Mahan's charges of falsifying his trip abroad were not sustained, meaning evidence did not support the accusation. In Elkins' book, he shows that there were many credible people, that came forward and signed affidavits saying he definitely went to Europe. He was on my ship. I gave him the ride over there, right? In fact, Mahan's charges of falsifying his trip abroad were not sustained. Yeah, okay. Mahan's charges of plagiarism were sustained because a small excerpt from his book matched sufficiently for the board. 2 of 3 lines repeated. Big deal. It had nothing to do with the Archko volume. Anyway, Goodwin's facts are as convoluted or worse than the facts he aims to discredit. He cites sources that are twice removed from eyewitnesses. For example, it's not going to be big enough. 1 second. So here it is. In Strange New Gospels, you can actually get this book on the internet. So I found it and read the chapters involved. In gathering evidence to lay before the presbytery, General Wallace, who was then American minister in Turkey, was consulted. The matter is fully discussed in his autobiography. Oh, well, I guess that's a done deal then, right? Although it falls in the part of the book written by Mrs. Wallace after the general's death. So, in other words, it's hearsay. You could not submit this to a court of law. It just wouldn't be accepted. And here's Goodspeed citing someone else who was cited by someone else. That's not good enough. Sorry. He certified that there's no Hebrew manuscript of the story of the Magi, as Mr. Mahan claimed to have used, was known to him. I don't know where he got that. There is no story of the Magi in the Archko volume. So what'd you do? Ask him a loaded question? He goes, nah, there's no such thing. It's like, right. If you ask me, Douglas, did you ever write the Fifth Symphony? No, I didn't. Doesn't make any sense. Anyway. And he says, no one connected with the United States legation in Constantinople in October 1883 had any knowledge of a visit of Mr. Mahan to the city. Nor could any of the American missionaries. Well, we had other people write affidavits saying he was there. So you found some people in the city that didn't know he was there. Constantinople's a pretty big place. Additionally, Goodspeed unnecessarily criticizes Mahan's education, which is patently absurd, considering the Bible knowledge alone involved or contained in the Archko volume is near exhaustive. Hillel is constantly quoting from all the minor prophets, major prophets, Proverbs, all the Chronicles and Kings histories. He darts all over the place, clearly demonstrating a complete knowledge of not only Old Testament, but also Jewish rabbinic interpretation of those Old Testament, because he says, this is what we believe, but now we know this is true, and that kind of thing. Much less all the recent history and church history he discusses, and then the pages and pages of ancient history discussed by the Hillel letters. Goodspeed unnecessarily criticizes the writing style as unskilled and sophomoric. Again, this book is fascinating thousands of skeptics and Christians alike. Far more enthusiasm has been shown this book than anything Goodspeed ever penned. There's no benefit to slamming the writing style other than pettiness and condescension. And in fact, I felt that the writing, especially of Pontius Pilate, was nearly Shakespearean, the way he described things. You got to go read it. Anyway, and it reminds me, there's also a place where Goodspeed is like slamming it is just more criticism is hardly worth my time. And it reminds me of the Pharisees not believing in Jesus when they said, then came the officers to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said unto him, why have you not brought him? Jesus, they're trying to go get Jesus so they could arrest him. And the officers answered, never a man spoke like this guy. And they answered them, the Pharisees, are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? Right? And here's Goodspeed relying on his education, impeccable education. But this people who knoweth not the law are cursed. They answered him, you were born in sins, and do you teach us? And they threw him out. That was about the blind man who received his sight. So Pharisees just love, or hypocrites, Pharisees, false religious teachers, like Goodspeed, they love to cite their own credentials and then say, you teach me. And it's like they're holding their education over your head. That's not how it's done. It's not. You're not a believer anyway. You didn't believe the Bible, so why would you believe something that substantiates the Bible, right? Of course it had to be fake. Now, finally, why I believe in it myself, the Archko volume. The Archko stories smack of authenticity. You read them, and they strike a nerve. Everything in there, the story of Mary and Joseph, Mary being, trying to push Jesus into the limelight, and then we see it actually happen at the wedding of Cana, but I didn't necessarily conclude that that's what she was doing, but apparently so. And then later this is confirmed by Peter and John. The writings are from a variety of perspectives and philosophies. When you read Pontius Pilate or Herod, they accuse the Jews of being superstitious, people, and they complain about how many sects they're all divided into, and that they don't even agree with each other, so for sure they're not going to agree with Jesus, and all these clever perspectives that I never thought of anyway. There is no significant deviation from biblical accounts in the whole book. There's not a single place in here where something happens that's goofy, that you go, oh, that could not have happened. That is, there's nowhere where Jesus flies around or does out of character miracles, does silly stuff, behaves oddly, making a pass at a woman, for example, or other such thing, or says stupid, incoherent things that sound scriptural but are off. I could mention a few religious documents that give that impression when you read them. You know, they'll babble. If you remember Monty Python's Holy Grail, when they're reading the big bit about the holy hand grenade, right? It's clearly a lark. Who could have conceived of the notion that Jesus appeared to Caiaphas? It's just incredible to me to believe that God has so much mercy that he appeared to his unrighteous accuser and executor. If Reverend Mahan made all this up, why not just present the materials as made up? It's still an awesome read, even if we have to pretend that Reverend Mahan simply wrote from his imagination. I mean, it really is. I totally enjoyed the Harry Potter books. We know none of that happened, right? So if Reverend Mahan would have presented the book as saying, oh, by the way, these are just some stories I made up, boom, we would have loved him anyway. He's got nothing to gain by lying about their authenticity. And as a Christian, Reverend Mahan knows that to lie is to sin. To lie would be to align himself with the father of lies, Satan. He would therefore be denying God the Father, whom he is trying to serve here, for no reason. It therefore makes no sense whatsoever for Mahan to lie about these manuscripts or anything about them. Furthermore, the apologetics in Hillel III's letters are so intelligent, so filled with historical trivia, some of which is all but forgotten to the dustbin of history, that why wouldn't Mahan just write them himself and claim authorship? The letters are genius. The whole book is genius. The level of knowledge required to forge these writings, is that right? That's probably the wrong spelling, is significant. Here are just a few of his historical references that I found were legitimate. Philo, the Hellenistic Jew philosopher; Cornelius Tacitus, he's a Roman historian; Quintilian, a Roman educator from 35 AD; Flavius Josephus was a Roman and Jewish historian from 37 to 100 AD; Johann Lorenz von Moschim was 1693 to 1755, was a German Lutheran church historian. Thomas Stackhouse was a Bible historian from the 1600s. Nathaniel Lardner was an English Presbyterian theologian from the 1600s. Charles Guiteau, who's he? He was the assassin of President James Garfield, not as celebrated as Williams James Booth, was it? I'm not up on my presidential assassins today. Pope Gregory IX, Ptolemy, king of Alexandria; Cernus Samniticus, teacher of M. Antonius Africanus, son of Gordianus the Great, who left his library of 62,000 volumes to his student. Now, there's an interesting story with a bunch of interesting people. Interesting story behind that, too, but you can go research it. I didn't have time. Homer wrote the Iliad and Odyssey; Laws of Shammai, Jewish scholar; and Abtalion, first century Pharisee leader, and Hillel. Constantine von Tischendorf, German theologian, who found the Codex Sinaiticus. So, after reading about all these people and drawing from all those documents, Goodspeed had the nerve to call Mahan uneducated. I'm sorry, but that's a lie. Completely a lie. And do we want to believe liars? No, we don't. So there you go. That's my reasons for believing it, and hopefully I'll have an episode on with Mr. Edward Elkins, and he'll tell us why he believes, or whether or not he believes. We'll find out. So until then, everybody, please take care.